So, these notes go in your HBS course file. There are three different types of notes, or there are three different types of joints: fibrous joints, cartilaginous joints, and synovial joints. So let's take a look at each one of these. So, fibrous joints. With this joint, there is no movement, or very, very little movement. They have fibrous tissue between the bones. Some examples of fibrous joints are the sutures in the skull and that joint where our teeth attaches to the jawbone. So fibrous joints have no movement. Fibrous tissue between the bones. Examples are the sutures in the skull and the roots of the teeth to the jawbone. Next are the cartilaginous joints. These have a little bit of movement, and as the name suggests, there's cartilage between the bones. Examples are the pubic symphysis and intravertebral discs. So think of our pelvic girdle model. It's got like pieces of plastic where the pubic symphysis comes together. That would be the joint, and it's that cartilage in between it. Intravertebral discs. So in our vertebrae, in between each of those, there is cartilage. And so we do have some movement of our spine. So cartilaginous joints have a little bit of movement, have cartilage between the bones. Examples are the pubic symphysis and intravertebral discs. And that's our example of cartilaginous joints. Next one is synovial joints. So synovial joints are freely movable. There is articulating surfaces. That means those bones are moving past one another. They articulate with one another. And so those articulating bone surfaces are covered with cartilage, but are not directly connected with tissue or cartilage. There is an oily, fluid-filled cavity between the bones, and there are 6 types of synovial joints. Each have a different type of motion. So synovial joints are freely movable. The articulating bone surfaces are covered with cartilage, but are not directly connected with tissue or cartilage. There's an oily, fluid-filled cavity between the bones. And there are 6 types of synovial joints. Each have a different type of motion. And so our picture right here represents one of our synovial joints. Our articular cartilage, that's the cartilage that is on that bone right there where those 2 surfaces would move against each other. And between here we have our synovial fluid. So 6 different types of synovial joints. So this picture represents the 6 different types, and we're going to go ahead and define them. So first one is a saddle joint. So this is a saddle joint. You might want to number that, number 1. Saddle joints have backward/forward and side to side, but no rotational movement. Saddle joints have backward/forward and side to side, but no rotational movement. This is an example of a saddle joint. Next, ball and socket. Let's see here. This is an example of a ball and socket joint here in our hip, so you might want to mark that number 2. The ball and socket joint has backward, forward, sideways, and rotation movement. Backward, forward, sideways, and rotating movements. That's the ball and socket joint. Next, the condyloid. So the condyloid joint is this one right here. So you might want to mark that number 3, condyloid joint. It has no rotation, but it can move back and forth in multiple directions. So no rotation, but it can move back and forth in multiple directions. The plane joint, this is number 4 right here, the plane joint. It has gliding movement. Plane joint has gliding movement. The hinge joint has bending and straightening movement. The hinge joint, so this is number 5 right here. This is our hinge joint. It has bending and straightening movement. And number 6, we have our pivot joint. The pivot joint has limited rotating movements. Pivot joint has limited rotating movements. So our pivot joint would be this one right here. And these are just examples. So there's other, say, hinge joints. So I've got another hinge joint in my knee. I've got another ball and socket in my shoulder. So those are just an example of where to find each one of those joints. Okay, so next page. Notice I have these highlighted. I also have some highlighted areas down here.